I still remember that night like it just happened. The air was cold, one of those early November evenings when the chill cuts straight through your bones. The street was quiet, except for the sound of wind brushing through the oak trees lining our front yard. The glow from our house spilled onto the driveway, warm and inviting, the way it always looked when we had guests over. Only this time, I wasn't the host. I had just pulled into the neighborhood after a long weekend trip with my husband, Mark. We'd been visiting his parents in Boston for their anniversary, and honestly, I was exhausted. I just wanted to get home, kick off my boots, and sleep. But the moment I turned onto our street, something didn't feel right. Cars lined both sides of the road in front of our house. Music drifted through the night air, loud, careless laughter, the clinking of glasses, people cheering. My first thought was that maybe our neighbors were throwing a party, but as I drove closer, my heart sank. The sound wasn't coming from next door. It was coming from our living room. "Mark, what the hell?" I muttered, slowing down. "Who's at our house?" He frowned, squinting through the windshield. "Maybe your sister stopped by? Or your parents?" But deep down, I already knew that wasn't it. When we parked, I could see shadows moving across the windows, people dancing, chatting, drinking. And right there, on the front porch, sitting huddled together on the cold steps, were two figures I would recognize anywhere. "Mom?" I whispered. My breath caught in my throat. "Dad?" I jumped out of the car before Mark could even react. The cold hit me hard as I ran toward them. My mother, Linda, was wrapped in a thin gray sweater, her hands trembling against her knees. My father, Robert, sat beside her, his face pale, his shoulders shaking under an old wool coat that looked far too light for the weather. "Mom! Dad! What are you doing out here?" I dropped to my knees in front of them. "Why aren't you inside?" Linda looked up slowly. Her eyes glistened in the dim porch light. "We were told to wait out here," she said softly, her voice breaking. "They said it was family only." I froze. "What? Who said that?" Robert didn't speak. He just stared down at his shoes, his jaw tight. I could see the shame written all over his face, and something inside me cracked open. Mark came up behind me, his voice low but tense. "What's going on? Why are your parents sitting out here?" I turned to him, my throat tightening. "My in-laws are inside," I said. "Your parents are throwing a party. In our house." For a moment, he didn't say anything. The noise from inside grew louder. Someone had just started another song, people laughing, clapping along. My mother winced at the sound, her hands tightening around her small purse. "I told your mother we'd come by," Linda said quietly. "She said she wanted to meet Robert again, maybe make peace after everything. So we came early. But when we got here, she told us the house was full. She said there wasn't enough room." Robert finally spoke, his voice rough. "She said maybe we could wait outside until the dinner was done. Said it wouldn't take long." I couldn't breathe for a second. The idea that my parents, my gentle, aging parents, had been sitting out here in the cold while my in-laws drank champagne inside my own house made something inside me snap. "Mark?" I said sharply. "How could your mother do this?" He rubbed his face, looking completely stunned. I didn't even know she was here, Sarah, I swear. But I didn't want excuses. I stood up, my hands trembling, and marched to the front door. The music hit me full in the chest as soon as I opened it. Bright lights, perfume, the smell of roasted chicken and wine. People were laughing and dancing in my living room. The furniture pushed aside to make space, and there, in the center of it all, was my mother-in-law, Margaret, wearing a glittering blue dress, a glass of wine in her hand, looking as if she owned the world. When she saw me, her smile froze. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her tone overly sweet. "You're back early. What's going on here?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. "Why are you throwing a party in my house?" She blinked. "Oh, don't be dramatic, dear. We just invited a few friends over. You weren't using the place, and everyone wanted to celebrate the fundraiser's success." I stared at her, barely able to keep my voice steady. "And my parents? Why are they sitting outside in the cold?" Her expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly forced a smile. "They showed up uninvited. I didn't want to make things awkward. They could have waited in the car if they were cold." My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear her. Around us, people started to notice the tension. The laughter faded. Someone turned down the music. "You told my 65-year-old parents to wait outside while you threw a party in my house?" I said quietly, my voice shaking. "What kind of person does that?" Mark stepped forward, his face pale. "Mom, you need to leave. Right now." Margaret looked offended, then forced a laugh. "Oh, come on. Don't be ridiculous. It's just a little misunderstanding." But it wasn't. It was something far deeper. Something that had been building for years between my family and his. Something cruel and cold that I could no longer ignore. I turned away before I could say something I'd regret. My parents were still on the porch when I came back out, their breath visible in the icy air. I wrapped my mother's coat tighter around her shoulders and said softly, "You're coming with me." "We're leaving." Linda looked up at me, her lips trembling. "Sarah, it's okay. We didn't want to cause trouble." But I shook my head. "You didn't cause this," I said. They did. And as I led them down the steps, past the glowing windows and the laughter still echoing inside, I knew one thing for sure. That night had changed everything. The drive that night felt endless. The city lights blurred through the windshield as I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but my mind was spinning. My parents sat quietly in the back seat. My mom held her hands together, rubbing them gently to stay warm. My dad stared out the window, his reflection faint against the dark glass. He hadn't said a word since we left the house. Mark was in the passenger seat, his hands gripping his knees, face tight with guilt. I could feel the tension between us, thick, suffocating. The only sound in the car was the hum of the tires on the highway and the occasional sniffle from my mom. After a few minutes, I broke the silence. "How long were you two out there?" I asked, my voice softer now. My mom hesitated. "A little over an hour," she said quietly. "We thought maybe someone would notice, but no one did." I bit my lips so hard it hurt. I didn't trust myself to speak. Mark turned slightly, his voice low. "Linda, Robert, I had no idea my mom would do something like that. I'm so sorry." Robert finally looked up, meeting Mark's eyes in the rearview mirror. "You didn't tell her to, son," he said calmly. "But you should have known the kind of woman she is." Mark didn't reply. He just nodded, staring at his hands. I pulled into my parents' driveway about 20 minutes later. Their small white house looked quiet and lonely under the porch light. I helped my mom out of the car, wrapping my arm around her as we walked up the steps. My dad followed slowly behind us. Inside, the house was neat as always. My mom still had her fall decorations out. Small pumpkins on the table, cinnamon candles, a faded family photo from when I was 10 hanging near the door. It smelled like home, like everything good and safe that I'd grown up with. But now, even that comfort felt tainted. My mom sat on the couch, shivering slightly. I brought her a blanket while Mark made tea in the kitchen. My dad took a seat across from her, still silent, still tense. When the tea was ready, I finally sat down. "You should have called me," I said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to sit there like that." Linda shook her head. "We didn't want to make a scene. We thought maybe we misunderstood. Maybe she didn't mean it that way." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Mom, she meant it exactly that way." Robert looked up. "Your mother-in-law never liked us," he said. "I knew that from the first dinner, but I didn't think she'd go this far." Mark leaned forward, his voice filled with regret. "She's always been controlling, Dad. But this was too much. I'll handle it, I promise." I glanced at him. "How? By apologizing for her again?" "That's what you've been doing for years." He winced. "Sarah, come on." "No, Mark," I said, cutting him off. "You let your mother take over everything. Our wedding, our house, even how we raise Emma. You never draw a line. And now she humiliated my parents. On my porch, in front of strangers." Mark's shoulders slumped. "You're right," he said after a moment. "You're completely right. I've let her get away with too much." The words hung there. For the first time in years, he wasn't defending her. My mom reached over and touched my hand. "Don't fight over us, sweetheart. Please. We just want you both to be happy." I smiled weakly, but inside I was boiling. Happiness wasn't possible when someone like Margaret controlled every moment of my life. After a few minutes, my dad stood up. "It's late. You two should get home." I shook my head. "I'm not going back there tonight." Mark looked at me, uncertain. "Then where?" "Here," I said. "I'm staying with them. You can go if you want, but I'm not setting foot in that house until your mother's gone." He looked at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll deal with it tomorrow." When he left, the sound of his car fading into the distance felt like the closing of a chapter I hadn't realized I was done with. I helped my parents settle in for the night. My mom finally smiled faintly when I tucked a blanket around her shoulders. "You always were the strong one," she said softly, "even as a little girl." I kissed her forehead. "Not strong, Mom. Just tired of pretending." Later, after they went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my untouched cup of tea. The silence of their small house felt heavier than ever. Every sound, every creak, every sigh of the heater reminded me how close I'd come to losing them to the cold that night. I thought about my in-laws laughing inside my house, warm and comfortable, while my parents shivered outside. It wasn't just cruel, it was inhuman. And I realized something then. This wasn't just about a party. It was about power, about respect, about what happens when you stay silent for too long. That night, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to let anyone treat my parents, or me, like that ever again. And as I sat there watching the clock tick past midnight, I had no idea that the next few days would unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and the people I trusted most. The next morning, sunlight crept through the blinds, soft and golden, falling across the kitchen counter. The air smelled like coffee and toast. My mom was already up, humming quietly as she poured a cup for my dad. They both looked tired but calm, as if the storm of the night before had finally settled into a heavy silence. I hadn't slept much. I'd spent half the night replaying everything in my head. My parents on the porch, Margaret's cold smile, Mark's face when I told him to leave. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. At around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. "Mark." I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hey," he said softly. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't slept either. "Did you talk to her?" I asked. "Yeah, she's not sorry, Sarah." I closed my eyes. "Of course she's not. She said she didn't mean any harm. That your parents showed up unexpectedly, and she was just trying to keep the evening comfortable for everyone." "Comfortable," I repeated bitterly. "For everyone but them," he sighed. "I told her she crossed a line. I told her she's not welcome in our house again until she apologizes to you and your parents." I was quiet for a moment. "And what did she say to that?" He paused. "She said if that's how I feel, maybe I should find another family to belong to." I almost laughed, but it came out as more of a scoff. "That sounds like her." "I'm serious, Sarah," he said. "She kicked me out." The words hit harder than I expected. "She what?" I packed a bag and left. "I'm at a motel right now. I didn't know where else to go." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I felt bad for him, truly. But I also couldn't ignore the small flicker of relief in my chest. Maybe, for once, he was starting to see the woman his mother really was. "Come here," I said finally. "We'll figure it out." He arrived about half an hour later. My dad was reading the paper when he walked in, his eyes narrowing slightly but not saying anything. My mom smiled politely and poured him a cup of coffee, because that's just who she is. Kind, even to the people who hurt her. Mark sat down at the table, rubbing his hands together. "I can't believe she did this," he said quietly. "I mean, I knew she could be difficult, but this..." Robert folded his paper. "Son, with all due respect, you always knew. You just didn't want to see it." Mark didn't argue. He looked down, his voice small. "You're right." For a few minutes, no one spoke. The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence. Finally, I leaned forward. "Mark, this can't happen again. Not the parties, not the disrespect, none of it. I need to know you're with me this time." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "I am. I swear I am. I wanted to believe him." I really did. That afternoon, after my parents took a nap, Mark and I drove back to the house to check on things. When we pulled into the driveway, The place looked like a tornado had passed through. Empty bottles, plates, napkins, all left behind from the party. The front door was still unlocked. I stepped inside slowly. The living room smelled faintly of wine and perfume. The cushions were out of place, a few stains on the rug, laughter still echoing faintly in my mind. Mark stood beside me, shaking his head. I can't believe she treated our home like this. I turned to him. She didn't just disrespect the house, Mark. She disrespected us. He nodded. I know, and I'm going to fix it. How? He hesitated, then pulled his phone from his pocket. I recorded our conversation this morning. I frowned. What do you mean? He scrolled for a second, then pressed play. His mother's voice filled the air, sharp, cold, and dripping with condescension. You always let that girl control you, she was saying. She's beneath you, Mark. Her parents are beneath us. If you think I'm going to apologize to them, you've lost your mind. Then quieter. You can have your wife or you can have your family. But you can't have both. The recording ended, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I felt my stomach twist. She really said that? He nodded. Every word. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. Instead, I walked to the couch and sat down, staring at the floor. This isn't just about me or my parents anymore, I said slowly. She's trying to control you too. She always has. He sat beside me, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, and I think I've finally had enough. That night, we stayed at the house together, cleaning up the mess. It was quiet, almost peaceful, as if the walls themselves were trying to breathe again. Mark threw out the last of the empty bottles while I scrubbed the kitchen counter. When we were done, we stood there for a long time, just looking around. The house felt different, emptier but lighter somehow. Mark turned to me. I'm going to talk to her one last time. Not to argue, but to tell her we're done letting her run our lives. Are you sure? I asked softly. He nodded. I need to do this. For both of us. And in that moment, I believed him. But I didn't know then that Margaret wasn't the type of woman to back down quietly. She'd spent years manipulating the people around her, and she wasn't about to let go of her control that easily. The next confrontation wouldn't just test Mark's loyalty. It would tear open old wounds neither of us were ready to face. Mark decided to meet his mother that Sunday afternoon. The sky was gray, the kind that promises rain but never follows through. I didn't go with him. He said he wanted to handle it alone this time, and I understood. There are some things a man has to face without someone holding his hand. Before he left, he stood by the door, jacket in one hand, keys in the other. No matter what happens, he said quietly, I'm not letting her get between us again. I nodded. Just don't let her twist your words. You know how she is. He gave me a faint smile. Yeah, I know. When the door closed behind him, the silence in the house felt heavy. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, trying to distract myself by cleaning things that were already spotless. Every sound outside made me look toward the window. Every few minutes I checked my phone, hoping for a text that didn't come. Meanwhile, Mark was pulling into the long, circular driveway of his parents' house. It was a beautiful property on the edge of town, old brick with white shutters and a porch that looked straight out of a magazine. Everything about it screamed wealth and control. He parked, took a deep breath, and walked up to the door. Margaret opened it before he could even knock. She was dressed perfectly, as always, hair curled, pearls around her neck, that same practiced smile she wore whenever she wanted to pretend she wasn't furious. Mark, she said smoothly. I didn't expect you so soon. He stepped inside. I told you we needed to talk. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You sound serious. I am. They moved to the sitting room, the one no one was allowed to actually sit in. Everything was spotless. Crystal vases, gold-framed family photos, rugs that looked too expensive to walk on. Mark didn't bother with small talk. You owe Sarah and her parents an apology. Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. Oh, Mark, you've always been too soft. This isn't softness, Mom. It's decency. You left 2 elderly people sitting outside in the cold. In my house. Her voice hardened. They weren't invited. I don't entertain people who look down on me. He frowned. Look down on you? They've never said a bad word to you. They didn't have to, she said sharply. It's in the way they look at me. Like I'm some kind of monster for wanting what's best for you. Mark sighed. You don't want what's best for me. You want control. Margaret crossed her arms. I made you who you are, Mark. Everything you have. Your career, your education, your house. It's because of me. You think that wife of yours would have even looked at you if I hadn't pushed you to succeed. He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. You didn't push me to succeed. You pushed me to obey. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You sound just like your father. Maybe that's a good thing. The room went still. For a moment, she looked like he'd slapped her. You don't know what your father was like, she said coldly. You were too young to understand. I remember enough, he said. I remember him leaving when I was 12. I remember you telling everyone he walked out on us. But I also remember hearing you two fight, about money, about lies, about something you wouldn't tell him. Her face paled slightly. You're imagining things. No, I'm not. He took a step closer. I talked to Dad last week. Margaret froze. Mark continued. He told me everything. How you blamed him for everything that went wrong. How you cut him out of my life. How you never told me the truth about why he left. She looked shaken now, her hands trembling just slightly. He's a liar, she said weakly. He always was. Mark shook his head. He told me you were the one who wanted him gone, because he found out something you didn't want anyone else to know. Margaret swallowed. Enough, Mark. He didn't stop. He said you weren't just controlling. You were cruel. That you used people like chess pieces, even him. Even me. She stepped closer, eyes flashing with anger. You have no idea what I've done for you. You ungrateful boy. I know exactly what you've done, he said quietly. You've turned every person in your life into someone who fears you. There was a long pause. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the sound sharp in the silence. Finally, Margaret's voice broke. Everything I did was to protect this family. From what? She looked away. From people who wanted to take what we had. Mark frowned. Who? But she didn't answer. She just turned toward the window, her reflection ghosted against the glass. You'll understand someday, she whispered. He stared at her for a moment longer, then said softly, I already do. When he left, she didn't stop him. She just stood there, arms folded, watching him walk away like he was someone she didn't recognize anymore. Back home, I was sitting by the window when his car pulled into the driveway. I could tell just by his face that something had changed. He looked older somehow, tired but lighter. He came inside and sat across from me. It's done, he said. What happened? She didn't deny it, any of it. She just said she was protecting the family. I frowned. From what? He shook his head slowly. That's what I don't understand. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rain that had finally started to fall outside, soft and steady against the windows. Then Mark said quietly, Sarah, there's something else you should know. My dad, he wants to meet you. He said there's more I need to hear. Something about my mother's past. I stared at him, my heart beating faster. What kind of something? He looked down at his hands. He wouldn't say, just that it might explain why she's the way she is. The room fell silent again, and in that silence, I realized this story wasn't just about a cruel mother-in-law or a broken party. It was about secrets buried so deep, they were now clawing their way to the surface. And whatever those secrets were, they were about to change everything, again. The next evening, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Robert came home early from work, which was rare. He didn't say much, just loosened his tie and sat quietly on the couch, staring at the dark TV screen. Margaret moved around the kitchen, pretending to be busy, her hands trembling slightly as she set the table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence like a slow reminder that something had broken between them. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried weight. Did you mean to embarrass me like that, Margaret? He asked without looking up. She froze, holding a plate in her hand. Embarrass you? Robert, they were your parents. They were outside in the cold. I know that, he said sharply. But you made a scene in front of everyone. My boss was there, my clients, my wife's parents. You could have handled it quietly. Margaret turned to face him. Her eyes were tired, red from the tears she'd been holding back since last night. Quietly? You wanted me to quietly ignore your parents freezing outside while strangers drank champagne in their house. Robert ran a hand over his face. You don't understand. No, you don't, she interrupted. You don't understand what it felt like to open that door and see them standing there. Your father's hands were shaking. Your mother couldn't even look at me. They weren't angry, Robert. They were ashamed. For a long moment, there was silence again. The weight of her words hung between them. Robert leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His voice softened. I didn't know they'd come. I told them I'd visit next weekend. They didn't come for a party, Margaret said. They came to see their son. And when they saw the cars outside, the noise, the laughter, they thought they weren't welcome anymore. Robert's jaw tightened. That's not true. Then tell me, she said quietly. When was the last time you visited them? Really visited them, Robert. Not a quick hello on the phone. Not a rushed stop with a gift card. When was the last time you sat with your mother and listened to her stories? Or helped your father fix something in the yard? He didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Margaret placed the last plate on the table and sat down. Her voice softened. You've been trying so hard to prove something to everyone else. Your boss, your in-laws, your friends. But somewhere along the way, you forgot who you were doing it for. Robert finally looked at her. His eyes were tired too. You think I don't feel guilty? You think I haven't noticed them getting older every time I visit? I do, Margaret. But every time I try to fix things, life just pulls me somewhere else. There's always something, work, bills, expectations. I don't know when I stopped being a son and started being a stranger. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Then it's time to stop letting life pull you. Go to them, Robert. Go before it's too late. He looked at her hand on his and didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of truth, raw and unfiltered. Later that night, Robert sat in his office, staring at the old family photo on his desk. It was taken 20 years ago at a park in Ohio. His mother was laughing, holding a picnic basket, his father beside her with an arm around his shoulder. He looked happy, careless, young. He picked up his phone, thumb hovering over his father's number. Then he put it down again. Not tonight, he told himself. Tomorrow. He'd call them tomorrow. But tomorrow never really comes when guilt is heavy and pride stands in the way. At midnight, Margaret walked into the office to find him asleep on the couch, the photo frame still in his hand. She covered him with a blanket, whispered a small prayer under her breath, and turned off the light. Outside, rain began to fall. It tapped softly against the window, steady, cold, and patient. Like time, it never stopped. It was early Saturday morning when Margaret woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. She reached over Robert, who was still half asleep, and picked it up. Her voice was groggy. Hello? A pause. Then a quiet, shaky voice came through. Is this Mrs. Thompson? Yes, who's this? Margaret sat up, instantly alert. This is Officer Daniels from the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. Are you related to Mr. and Mrs. George Thompson? Margaret's heart dropped. They're my husband's parents. Why? What happened? The officer hesitated. There's been an accident. Your father-in-law was driving home from the grocery store last night. The road was slick from the rain. They were taken to Mercy Hospital. By now, Robert was awake, staring at her as she repeated the words. His face went pale. What? What happened to them? Margaret's voice trembled as she handed him the phone. They're in the hospital, Robert. He jumped out of bed, already searching for his car keys. There were no words, just the sound of panic, the kind that takes your breath before you even realize you're moving. Margaret followed him, her hands shaking as she tried to grab a coat. The drive to the hospital was silent, except for the windshield wipers and the hum of the tires on wet pavement. Robert's mind raced. Every mile felt like an accusation, every red light like a punishment for waiting too long. When they finally reached the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the faint beeping of machines filled the air. A nurse guided them down a narrow corridor, Robert's steps slowed as they approached the room. Through the small window in the door, he saw his mother, Mary, lying in bed, a bandage around her forehead. His father, George, sat in a wheelchair beside her, his arm in a sling. When they looked up and saw him, neither spoke at first. Robert froze in the doorway. His throat closed up. "Dad, Mom..." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Robert." Her voice cracked like glass. He walked in slowly, ashamed to meet their eyes. George looked older than he remembered, his face thinner, his shoulders smaller. But his voice was steady. "You came," he said softly. Robert's chest tightened. "Of course I came. I should have been here sooner." He stopped, his words breaking apart. "I'm so sorry." Mary reached for his hand. Her skin was cool and frail, but her touch was gentle. "You don't need to say that, honey. You're here now. That's what matters." He wanted to believe that. He wanted forgiveness to be that simple. But standing there, surrounded by machines and the quiet hum of a hospital, he realized how long he'd been gone. Not in distance, but in presence. Margaret sat quietly beside them, letting them talk. She could see Robert's guilt spilling out in fragments, apologies for missed birthdays, forgotten calls, the dinner party that had broken something between them. After a while, George said quietly, "You know, son, when you were little, I used to stand outside your door just to listen to you breathe. You'd fall asleep holding that toy truck, and I'd think, someday he's going to build a life bigger than mine. And you did, but I never thought you'd build it so far away from us." Robert closed his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "I never meant to." "I know," his father said. "Life gets busy, but family's not something you put off for later." For the first time, Robert broke down completely, the kind of crying that comes from deep inside, the kind that feels like it's been waiting years to escape. His mother held his hand. His father reached out and touched his shoulder. No one said anything. They just sat there, the silence filled with all the things that never needed to be said out loud. Hours passed before they left the hospital. On the way home, Robert didn't speak. He just drove, eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. Margaret watched him, knowing that something inside him had shifted for good. When they finally pulled into their driveway, he parked the car and sat quietly for a while. "I can't keep living like this," he said softly. "I can't keep chasing things that don't matter while the people who raised me are waiting alone." Margaret nodded. "Then don't. Bring them home." Robert turned to her, his voice firm now. "I will." That night, for the first time in years, he picked up the phone, not to delay, not to promise tomorrow, but to make things right today. The next morning, his parents' bags were packed. The house that had once been filled with noise, laughter, and strangers now waited quietly, ready for the return of the only people who ever truly mattered. 2 weeks later, the Thompson house didn't feel the same. The air was softer. The laughter that once echoed from shallow parties was replaced by the quiet rhythm of family life. Margaret had rearranged the guest room on the first floor, turning it into a cozy space for George and Mary. New curtains, a small TV, and a rocking chair by the window. It felt like home again. Robert stood at the front door that morning, waiting for the sound of his parents' car. He'd picked them up from the hospital before, but this was different. Today, they were coming home, not to visit, not for a few days, but to live with them. To stay. When the taxi pulled up, Robert rushed out. He helped his father first, steadying him as he stepped out, then turned to his mother. She smiled up at him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. "Welcome home," he said softly. Mary looked at the house, then back at him. "It's been a while since you said that," she replied, her voice trembling. Inside, Margaret had set the table for lunch. The smell of chicken soup filled the kitchen, the kind Mary used to make when Robert was a boy. When his parents walked in, she hugged them both warmly. "This house was too quiet without you," she said, and she meant it. They sat together at the table, eating slowly, talking about small things at first. Old neighbors, recipes, the weather. But underneath every sentence was a deeper meaning. Forgiveness, love, and the quiet rebuilding of something fragile. Later that evening, Robert found his father sitting outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset. He joined him, handing over a cup of tea. For a while, neither of them spoke. The orange light reflected off the windows, and the air smelled of rain-soaked earth. George finally said, "You know, son, I didn't think I'd see this place again. I thought that night at your door, that was the end of it." Robert swallowed hard. "It almost was, and it would have been my fault." George nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that you came back to fix it. I just wish I hadn't waited so long." His father smiled faintly. "That's the thing about time. It doesn't stop for anyone. But as long as you're still breathing, you've got a chance to make things right." Robert looked at him, realizing that this quiet, simple man had carried more wisdom than all the people he'd spent years trying to impress. For the first time, he didn't feel like a successful man trying to prove something. He just felt like a son, grateful, grounded, and finally home. Inside, Mary and Margaret were laughing over something small. A spilled glass of milk, maybe, or an old story retold. Their voices drifted through the window, light and warm. It was the kind of sound a house needed to feel alive. That night, after everyone went to bed, Robert stood in the living room and looked around. The family photo that once sat dusty in his office now hung proudly on the wall. He touched the frame gently. He whispered, "Never again. No more ignoring phone calls. No more choosing strangers over family. No more waiting for someday." From that day forward, weekends were for family dinners. Birthdays were celebrated properly. Evenings were spent talking, not working late. Robert and Margaret built new memories, simple ones but meaningful. And sometimes, when the weather turned cold and snow dusted the ground, Robert would glance out the front window. He'd remember that night, the one that changed everything, the image of his parents shivering outside while laughter echoed from within. It became a reminder. A scar he would never hide, because it kept him honest. One winter evening, months later, he found Mary sitting by the fireplace, a blanket around her shoulders, smiling as Margaret read an old Christmas card aloud. George was dozing beside her. The house glowed with quiet warmth. Robert stood there watching them. For the first time in years, he felt whole. He turned to Margaret and whispered, "You saved us that night." She smiled softly. "No, Robert. You did, when you opened the door." And as the fire crackled and snow began to fall outside, the house no longer carried the echoes of neglect or guilt. It carried something far stronger: love, forgiveness, and the kind of peace that only comes when a family finds its way back home. A year passed, and with it, the kind of quiet change that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. The Thompson house in suburban Ohio no longer looked like the cold, modern place it once was. It was warm, lived in, filled with the smell of fresh coffee in the mornings and the sound of soft music in the evenings. Margaret had started keeping flowers by the window, sunflowers in summer, chrysanthemums in fall. Mary loved tending to them, humming softly as she watered each pot. George spent most mornings on the porch, reading the paper while Robert sat beside him, coffee in hand, talking about everything they'd missed over the years. Sometimes, neighbors who used to attend the Thompsons' fancy parties would walk by and stop to chat. They'd glance curiously at the old couple sitting by the porch, and Robert would smile proudly. "My parents," he'd say. "Not the guests, not visitors, just my parents." It was a phrase that carried weight, the kind that comes from learning what truly matters. Margaret watched all of it quietly, the way a person does when they know they've witnessed a transformation. The house had gone from a symbol of success to a home built on grace and second chances. One chilly December evening, the four of them sat by the fireplace, the same place where months ago there had been silence and distance. The fire crackled, soft light dancing across the walls. Mary held an old photo album open on her lap, pictures of Robert as a boy, smiling in the yard, covered in mud, his father laughing behind him. Mary looked up at her son and said, "You were always running ahead, Robert, even back then, but I'm glad you found your way back." Robert took her hand gently. "I'm not running anymore, Mom," George chuckled quietly. "Good, because we're too old to chase you." They all laughed, and for a moment, time felt still. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Robert stood by the front door. The same door his parents once stood outside, shivering and unwanted. He opened it and looked out into the cold night. Snow was falling again, soft and steady, covering the world in white. He didn't see guilt anymore when he looked at that door. He saw a reminder, a promise that it would never be closed to them again. He whispered to himself, "The door stays open," and it did. In the years that followed, the Thompsons' home became a place people wanted to be. Holidays were loud and joyful. Neighbors stopped by for coffee. The house that once echoed with emptiness now overflowed with laughter, stories, and the quiet heartbeat of family. When Mary passed peacefully in her sleep a few years later, and George soon after, Robert grieved, but he didn't carry regret. He had given them what they'd always wanted: time, love, and the dignity of belonging. And when he looked at the photo on the mantel, his parents smiling on the porch, snow falling behind them, he knew one simple truth. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. That night, before turning off the lights, Robert did what he always did. He checked the lock on the door, then smiled and left it open.